You're watching or listening to Word in Your Ear. Of course you are, as you're never alone with a show that alights upon everything ever invented in the art of conversation. Whether that's regrettable rock and roll footwear, daft things audiences do, epic stage names, tracks to play at wedding parties, or the outer limits of Elmer Gantry's Velvet Opera. Do leave a like or subscribe by going to patreon.com/Word in Your Ear to discover further delights on offer. And now, get stuck into this. Welcome to another Word in Your Ear. Now, in an age where an indiscretion can get you cancelled, it does seem absolutely astonishing now that rock musicians were once so publicly fascinated by the Third Reich. And anyone these days doing anything that Daniel Rachel records in This Ain't Rock and Roll would, I think, see their career immediately go up in smoke. Daniel, it's very nice to see you again.
Yeah, it's wonderful to be back on the show. Thank you for having me.
The show. We love it, the show.
Max
It
show.
must go on. That's great. Well, look, we've had you on before several times, actually. Once talking about two-tone and talking about Red Wedge and various other things. But what was the start point for this book? Why did you particularly want to write this book? And explain what it is, too, actually.
Well, it's about pop music, the swastika and the Third Reich, and traces a history from Tommy Steele to Kanye West and of people who have flirted with these issues. I think there's two jumping off points, really. One is the immediate idea for the book, which strangely came from a conversation with Billy Bragg I had, who has very kindly subsequently written the introduction. But it's the idea that can music change the world? And he always says it can't. And, you know, he's got 40 years experience to kind of come to that conclusion. But we've often debated it and maybe settled on it's a catalyst. And I began to think of musicians and orchestras in the camps in the Second World War and whether they had saved lives. And I began to want to write in that area until I realized that it had been done by many greater historians than myself. And then because my DNA is rock and roll, I thought, well, where's the marriage there? And so it naturally led into how's the swastika being used post-war. But I think the true spark of this I can date back to when I was a child, and it's a twin marriage between falling in love with the Sex Pistols and particularly Belsen was a gas and owning the album The Great Rock and Roll Swindle, and really seeing the humour immediately in the playfulness of the word gas, obviously the substance in the air, and you know, an old term for something that's fun or a joke. And I would happily sing along to that. I thought it was very amusing that they used swastikas, or Sid Vicious would wear one. I got the humour of it all. But at the same time, a VHS tape arrived in our house, and it simply said on the spine, typed, the word Holocaust. And my mum put it on a very high shelf, a bookshelf, and said, we shall watch this together, but we really must watch this together. It's not for you to see by yourself. And of course, soon as they went out on a shopping expedition, yes, exactly, they put it on.
I want to traumatise myself, yes.
Yes, exactly. I didn't know what this was in any way whatsoever. And in my memory, Laurence Olivier narrated the film, and it wasn't the episode of the World in War, but it was over an hour of compiled footage of the liberation of the camps and all existing footage. And the juxtaposition of this, which I have to say has indelibly printed itself on my mind ever since, those images and the Pistols. And then very shortly after, I was told that there was a thing called the Joy Division, which I knew as a band, but I was told it was the name of the orchestra in Auschwitz, which was wrong. Obviously, it turned out to be, it was the name of the brothel in Auschwitz. So all of these elements and my fascination with that history, with bands playing with it, has, I guess, developed since then to now.
So how old were you at this time, Daniel, when you were singing along to the Great Rock and Roll Swindle?
Well, that came out in 1980, and I began getting records the following year. So I don't know, it would be, 81, 82, 83. It's all, I can't pin it precisely. It's
right. But how old were you roughly then?
Oh, well, I'm born in 69.
Right, okay.
And the Beatles are doing Abbey Road.
Right.
So that makes me 12, 13.
Yeah.
14.
No, it's kind of interesting because I slightly remember this from smash hits at the time, you know, that you got punk rock, and then I always say that punk rock happened commercially about 3 years after it happened really.
Especially in Birmingham.
Absolutely. And I noticed this through the mail order advertisements in smash hits, where, you know, and Sid Vicious had died, and there was a massive cult of Sid Vicious, wasn't there?
Yes.
And with that was linked all manner of outrage, and swastikas were part of it, you know, in a way that they hadn't been a few years earlier.
Oh, that's really interesting.
And I always felt that loads of people kind of flocking to revere Sid Vicious. I always felt, well, I think you kind of missed it. You know what I mean?
Well, as a boy, he's a perfect cartoon character, you know, and the posthumous singles are something else, where he's a cartoon figure with the cartoon swastika. It played to a schoolboy sensibility. And
it was a few years later that, you know, so it happens in London, 76, 77, whatever. And when you drive around the provinces of the UK in 1980, 81, gather around the war memorial of every small town you drive through are a bunch of punks, you know,
with
dressed up like that, you know, with a bottle of cider, with as many signs of to offend people as they can possibly cover themselves,
and making a toilet of it.
That's right. Massive shock
for themselves and the dogs.
Yeah. So I've got to ask you. You've mentioned Tommy Steele. That's where your story. Go and tell me how.
Well, I needed to start.
The blameless Tommy, Saint Tommy.
Well, you too. I don't want to make it. You're an older vintage than myself.
Yeah, of course.
And Tommy Steele was watched by Jack Good, the man behind so many of those 60s pop programs, as producer. And he went to see Steele. And he was then interviewed by Maureen Cleave, who become very synonymous with the Beatles. And he remarked that watching the audience react was like seeing Hitler at Nuremberg.
Right.
And it was one of the first mentions that I could see of the association between the footage of Leni Riefenstahl, the theatre that she captures of Albert Speer, the architect. I mean, they're magnificent theatrical events, as we well know, you know, the searing spotlights and the 30-foot golden eagle and the stone abutments and flags, and it's incredible theatre. And so that analogy is made and then sustains through many of our rock heroes. As we well know, Brian Ferry gets obsessed by Speer and the rallies, as does Bowie, as does Mick Jagger. And it just is a light way to introduce the book.
You talk about John Lennon as being one of the people that kind of most obviously started this. His tendency to to goose step and Nazi salutes in pub. Didn't they come back from Australia? I can't remember. No, it's in Australia. I think he did some kind of Nazi salute. You know, Dave and I are from a generation where we're old enough to remember that whole thing was just lampooning Nazi Germany. It was, you know, the war had happened, you know, our parents had been in it and they didn't talk about it as far as we were concerned, you know, as was Disney, as was Bond, you know, the Nazis were just cartoon idiots to be sent up, weren't they?
No, you're absolutely right, Mark. And you know, I'm not the Simon Wiesenthal of rock and roll. I'm not here to hang some of my favourite rock stars, nor yours either. But you know, there was other sides to John Lennon in that he had a Nazi memorabilia collection, and as a child he used to draw himself as the Führer, and instead of Heil Hitler, he'd write Heil John, and look. You know, that personal collection that he owned, which very importantly, he kept in the private domain, unlike somebody like Lemmy, who invited film cameras to see his collection with no contextualization just
Yeah,
here
we didn't
starts-
know that John Lennon had collected this stuff till after Cynthia died, I think, wasn't it? Or
And that's why, and as you
Yeah.
know, from the first chapter, we find this out because of a strange connection between Cynthia and a neo-Nazi, and that's why the collection becomes public knowledge. And but I was thinking, I knew you'd mentioned lampooning, and then you give me a slight heads up on the fact that nothing was shocking to you two as you were grown up in this period. And I was thinking, what is lampooning ultimately? And obviously, there's the element of you. You make a joke of it. You undermine who the enemy is, and you reduce them in what they stand for. And I think this is a precursor of what then grows in rock and roll, is that the Nazis can be seen in that kind of way and reduced to a certain comic level. But at the same time, what are we rejecting by doing that? And what we are rejecting is that the Third Reich was responsible for the worst atrocity of the 20th century. And it's the beginning of the divorcing of that tie, which can't be untied, but somehow rock and roll does. So it then increasingly embraces theatrics and continues to do so to the present day, whether it's through Lady Gaga or Kanye West. But we don't divorce in the modern age of rock and roll misogyny and sexism, and we don't divorce racism based on the color of somebody's skin. And a fantastic illustration of that would be Mick Jagger saying that the Stones will no longer perform one of their greatest songs ever, Brown Sugar, because he said that the references to slavery and what that's alluding to in the song is something that fitted where the Stones were at then in the early 70s, but something he would want to be draw a distance from now. We don't embrace images of the Ku Klux Klan or the overseers of plantations in the 30s. And in the same way, we don't embrace acts of male violence or rape, even though there's still sexism and misogyny in rock and roll, it's confronting these issues, and we're into a new era of what rock and roll is. But Nazism, the Third Reich, and by default, the persecution of the Jews and the path leading to the Holocaust still has a free pass, I would say.
It's funny because I was born in 1950, so it's 5 years after the end of the war, and you never doubted that any of that taken place. Nobody doubted that at all. And I first went abroad with my family at the age of 11. We drove through Europe, and my father, I think about this all the time, made sure we went to Dachau. I was 11 years old. And yet that existed. But at the same time, there was, if you look at the running gag in Hard Day's Night is, it's all about the war. It's, I fought a war for your sort. I bet you wish you'd lost, or, all that kind of stuff. It was just part of the humor of the time. But at the same time, people knew it was real. They had no doubt it was real because their parents, as Mark said, had kind of had some kind of, that touched that world. I suppose it's later on it becomes more of a play thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it changes when people start to use kind of Nazi imagery and ideology, whatever, as purely for shock tactics, really. There's a tiny mention of there's an example of that actually early on when I think you have Viv Stanshall of the Bonzos and Keith Moon going through Bethnal Green or whatever it is. Golders Green. Sorry, it's Golders Green.
Oh, God, yes.
Yeah, in a Jewish area, dressed in Nazi. I mean, that's obviously there to really antagonize people. But I think actually, and then you go through the period that you talk about with Roxy Music, and it's just the idea in the style of the German uniform or whatever. But it's really the punk rock when Malcolm McLaren deliberately used this just to shock and horrify people. And that's a different...
No, absolutely. I think it does. I think there's a sinister edge before Malcolm McLaren, without a doubt, with Brian Jones appearing on the front cover of many magazines and papers across the world in 68, dressed in an SS uniform with, trampling a doll, and with Anita Pallenberg at his feet, a woman that he violently beat. And there are other bands as well, particularly in America, and Ron Ashton in the Stooges. There's many, many examples where something else is happening, which is a more sinister edge, which obviously gets covered in the book. But I mean, the fascinating thing about Malcolm McLaren is that he was bar mitzvah and he grew up in a Jewish environment in Stoke Newington, and he introduced the swastika to punk, whereas at exactly the same time, his partner at that point, Bernie Rhodes, the manager of The Clash, and whose maternal line were survivors of the Holocaust, absolutely refused to allow his band or himself to have anything to do with the swastika, and they fell apart because of it. And Bernie speaks quite eloquently in the book about his disdain for what McLaren was doing, and furthermore, Caroline Coon, who went on to manage the Clash for a while, his whole, is totally condemning of the kind of person McLaren was. But he introduced the swastika, and there are shock elements, and within that, and I'm not here to call out artists in a sense that you must burn these records or never listen to them again. It's to say we have a history in rock and roll. This is what was said. This is what was done. Here it is, and I allow much of the judgment in the book to the reader. But there's Siouxsie Sue of the Banshees a big argument at the time was that we hadn't seen footage, we didn't really know, and yet at the same time their debut single Mittagessen hones in on a very particular part of Nazi history, of Hermann Goering making a great speech advocating iron ore over butter. Now, to have that kind of knowledge and to sing about it on your debut single is not somebody that doesn't know about history or have knowledge. So there's lots of contradiction.
It's the traditional pop music desperate desire to be noticed, isn't it? It's just going to spill over into some very unpleasant things from time to time, won't it?
And she did sing in that first song on the flip side, Love and Avoid, Too Many Jews for My Liking, which...
Really?
Which is incredible, really. So, punk is a very disturbing...
There was also London SS, wasn't there?
Was it Mick Jones's idea? Mick Jones's heritage is Lithuanian Jewish. And he always said it was social security. But at the first meeting of London SS, Bernie Rhodes came in with a swastika and slammed it down on a Shepherd's Bush pub table and said, if you stand for this, then I won't stand up for you. And, and there's, and it's very, there's lots of people in rock history, Blue Oyster Cult, two Jewish people, and playing with ideas from the Third Reich, using it very consciously because they've got a fascination with it. And yet there's Jewish people involved in the lyric writing, in the making of the records. This fascination with the era, with the costume, and ultimately a power and a sexuality. And I think this is a really fascinating area that I write about, which was Susan Sontag writing in the New York Review in the mid-70s, where there was a book on the SS regalia that had just been released, and she equates it all to women's magazines. You know how the nipples would be covered over by "buy this for $2.99," and so the book of SS regalia was marketed in exactly the same way with the same kind of ideas. And she says that the sexuality behind the uniform, behind Nazism, was integral to the uniform, and that stands up when I look back into the history of the uniform, which was distributed by Hugo Boss but designed by Karl Dibich, I think you pronounce it, Dibich. And the whole purpose of particularly the SS uniform, was to give off an air of menace, of power, of sexuality. We all know if somebody has a uniform, whatever kind of a uniform that is, particularly if you're of low income, it gives you a status and something to be admired. And this was part of how the Nazis came to power, that the uniform would have this power on the streets of Germany, and as they began to later invade other countries. That sexuality, disturbingly, carries all the way through into the concentration camps and extermination camps, where I found quite a few memoirs by survivors who would admire the beauty of, for example, Joseph Mengele, who was conducting medical experimentations on people in Auschwitz, or Ilse Koch, who was whipping and beating people to death in Buchenwald. And at the same time, they're admiring the magnificence of their look and and how it made them be in status.
Have you ever seen? There's a really good documentary called Hitler's Hollywood. Have you ever seen that?
No.
It's really good if you get a chance to see it. It's just about the German film industry during the era of the Nazis.
Right.
And you realize that Germany was the most advanced nation in the world when it came to developing visual images.
Incredibly so.
And the whole language of entertainment was developed through propaganda. There is also that thing, I think for Stephen, there was a Radio 4 documentary years ago where Hitler invented rock and roll. It was the idea that the tape machine was developed by, in Nazi Germany and was used. The Americans came in 1945, took it all home. And that's how rock and roll records came to be made,
As in the...
You could edit them.
As in 440 tuning, which is when you use a tuner and to the note A, which all guitars tune to, or keyboard A, that frequency was determined by Joseph Goebbels. Goebbels was a master of propaganda without a doubt. And
so if you go back to the Jack Good point, I think it's interesting, that even when it was people seeing Tommy Steele, and that's quite small potatoes, he thought, this is, we haven't seen crowds react like this since we saw the Nuremberg rallies. Whereas nowadays, huge gigs are bigger than ever before, and people act in a more uniform way than ever before, don't they, at those shows? And so, so that parallel still holds good, doesn't it? In some ways.
Well, the great illustration of this is obviously David Bowie, who got very, very deep.
Yes, he saw Triumph of the Will, didn't he? Isn't that right?
Yes.
The propaganda film. And just saw there were parallels between the way that audience was reacting, the people reacting at his big gigs, I think.
Exactly so. And Gene Simmons of Kiss said exactly the same, and Brian Ferry, and countless artists have drawn on this theatricality. I mean, David Bowie said that Adolf Hitler was the first rock and roll superstar, but his chapter's quite long because it's more than a 10-year fascination, and in later years he explained a lot of it to do with his fascination with the Arthurian legend and the idea of the Holy Grail and the fabled visit of Nazis to Glastonbury, and also what Himmler and the SS exploration for justification of the Aryan in antiquated history, which takes on a whole strange journey. But also Bowie at the same time had a Nazi memorabilia collection and was planning to make a film or a musical about Goebbels, and that's a lesser side that he didn't later kind of explain away, but he was definitely playing the Hitler role without a doubt.
As we're talking about Bowie, we ought to mention, and you mentioned it in the book, the incident in Victoria Station in 1976 where he's in a staff car that was actually a Mercedes owned by a South American dictator, and he waves at the crowd. Chalky Davis takes a picture of him, and that picture was doctored, wasn't it, to give the impression that he's giving a Nazi salute, which is one of the very first examples of kind of what goes on all the time now, which is a kind of a doctored picture giving the wrong impression. But tell us what happened.
I spoke to Chalky Davis, and he said that in his photograph, it's not as clear as it was in the printed edition, and that they had altered it in some way. And we all know that if you want to catch somebody's e-kiling, it's not very difficult, because of the nature of a waving. And in fact, Gary Newman is there present at the event, and he said nobody amongst the Bowie fans thought that they'd seen his e-kile. Yeah. But at the same time, here he is in kind of a kind of very Third Reich style outfit in an open top limo, his hair all back, and he's just come from a journey with Iggy Pop crossing over between Russia and Poland, where he was stopped, strip searched. His Nazi memorabilia collection was found. He was deep into the whole thing at that point, and then he plays at Wembley Arena, and there's a couple of people that I've spoken to that said the atmosphere crossed over at that gig and something else was going on. And Bowie's admitted, that there was a strange thing happening here, and he was being seduced by Nazism and by Hitler and by the Third Reich at large.
But also, regardless of Nazism, just as the totalitarian display is an incredibly seductive thing, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
And if you're Bruce Springsteen or Mick Jagger or anybody, and you've known what it's like to stand in front of 50,000 people and go, if I point there, they're all going to do the same thing.
Yeah,
that's really strong medicine. That is.
Well, you remember,
Queen
of course,
at Live Aid was the really
exactly.
Freddie
Mercury.
Radio Gaga, and the 80,000 people clapping in time.
What was that like when you were in the auditorium when that happened?
Well, I was up in the Perspex box. I was just watching it
the commentary
from
box.
afar. Yes, but it wasn't surprising at all, because the audience just enjoyed, and it's interesting in terms of this discussion because it kind of prefigured the way audiences are nowadays, which is they go along to be together and to all do something together. It's like all those people going to see Oasis. They're all going to be the same thing, and that's a very powerful thing. And that is something that Jack Good recognized in 1958 or whatever, that had roots in the 30s and there's nothing in British culture that did that before that, I would have thought.
Yeah.
Even football didn't work really in that way.
True.
Whereas,
all of this is about, to my mind, as you would have thought that perhaps that these elements would have died out in the 80s. And yet, to my surprise, when I was writing the book, where I thought it would be a finishing point, it then began to open out. And there were more and more illustrations and examples of artists that have flirted in this arena, and that becomes increasingly disturbing because the penumbra of the Second World War ever grows with no direct connection through family members or having been born in the 40s, and the idea that we can use elements, we can use the swastika and we can use the theatre of the Third Reich within a created area and it not be accountable, it becomes ever more disturbing. But mostly with, in the Super with Kanye West, in the Super Bowl last year, there was an advert for his T-shirt site, and when you went to it, one item was available. And it was a T-shirt, a white T-shirt with a swastika on it. And that was it. And Kanye West has openly talked about his admiration of Adolf Hitler. His latest single this year has the chorus, Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil, which is literally a chorus of voices all the way through it. And there's many K-pop artists that are wearing SS uniforms, of making songs out of Kristallnacht, the pogrom in 1938 of where Jewish people were rounded up or beaten and murdered. And there's a continuation of it. And, even in the Observer very recently, when there was a double spread and a feature on the Blitz exhibition in the Design Museum, and there was a photograph of Lemmy wearing a swastika and SS apparel. And as I say, this would not be allowed if it was anything to do with other forms of oppression. And I think where rock and roll has always been fantastic and amazing, and we should be proud of it, is when it fights societal injustice. And we have many examples of this. Perhaps the greatest of those is Nelson Mandela by the Special AKA. And rock and roll can confront atrocities and in ways that the establishment don't. And it has a great tradition of that. And yet here, something else is at play where it's being allowed. The fact that Joy Division, as I've talked to people in this book, are unaware of, particularly younger people, as they wear T-shirts or tote bags, are totally unaware of what the origin of the name of Joy Division is.
Well, because pop music nowadays, as context goes, my view of pop music is entirely chronological. It's a story. whereas my children or my grandchildren, it can't be like that. It's a superstore full of everything. And God knows when it got there or how it got there. They just take it and they use it, It's very difficult to restore any sense of context.
Because it's true, because when Joy Division formed and New Order, actually, I don't know if you do, Dave, I don't really remember any.
I remember it being mentioned.
It wasn't
a controversy. I don't remember a controversy. I remember
really.
the derivation of the
Spandau
name.
Ballet, people didn't quite, they just people just broadly just accepted that was the name, and it's only over the 40, 50 years later these things just have developed that kind of intensity.
I was thinking today about this. Do you know that Bonzo Dog tuned the intro and the outro, Daniel?
Yeah, it's referenced in the book, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Adolf Hitler on Vibe.
Hitler on Vibe. And it was the classic joke of the 60s and 70s. It was always Adolf Hitler on Vibes. Yeah. And yet you'd hear the vibes he'd play,
No, I mean, there was a lot of controversy around Joy Division at the time, because there were many factors, not least that this front cover takes from a Hitler Youth poster from 1936, but it's also the front cover of Joy Division's debut EP, An Ideal for Living. And Bernard Sumner found this image in Manchester Library and traced it, and then put that onto the front cover of the record. And then the record itself has an extract from the book House of Dolls, and House of Dolls was written by an Auschwitz survivor, and it charts the story of a Jewish girl who gets arrested and sent to a camp and is made to go into sexual slavery, which didn't happen to Jewish women, but it did happen on an extraordinary level in other areas. And they read from an extract from that book on that EP, and most of the songs have references to the Holocaust. They were deeply read and they deeply understood what they're doing. And there's a famous recording of Joy Division where Rudolf Hess is called out in his prison number, and then over the course of their career, many references to everything we're talking about. And then, of course, then they name themselves New Order, which they claim that partly at the time was more to do with Pol Pot and Cambodia, but it was seen as hugely suspicious at the time. And then subsequently, they've been answering questions like this, I think, for pretty much all of their career. And I have to say, in Bernard Sumner's defense, that in his memoir, he said, there are many things we did then that we wouldn't do now. And I also turned to Peter Hook, the bass player, who I think has perhaps got the best line in the whole book, where he says in his broad Mancunian accent, "We can't be Nazis, we're from Salford."
He's very good at that kind
he of is, he's very funny. No, but it's just that idea that if a group was to arrive today with a name like that, they'd be closed down immediately.
Yeah.
Right.
And yet we don't. As I say, my youngest daughter had the tote bag 17 when she was 17, and I asked her if she knew what Joy Division meant. She didn't even know it was a band. She just liked the of a bridge with snow on it and the name.
Yeah, that's because nobody expected any of this stuff to last. You know what I mean? The pop music. Yeah. Nobody thought we'd be talking about the intro and the outro 50 years later, or whatever it is. It's absolutely extraordinary. So there's the book, and I'm imagining the publishers are taking advantage of the fact that the other area of popular culture where this subject has not gone away is books, isn't it? You know what I mean? So is this in the history sections as well as the music section?
Oh, it's a good call, isn't it?
I'm you expect a hack like me to think of that.
Yeah.
The first thing I'd say to the sales manager, for goodness sake.
Educational.
Yes, absolutely. Well, ultimately what I've tried to do is lay out a long rock and roll history, and at the same time align that history and those events, the imagery, and the spectacle, to what the source of it is, and just to say to rock and roll fans, these two things belong together, and we can acknowledge our mistakes, or we can acknowledge what has previously happened. We can't change it, and I'm not for 1 minute saying that history should be wiped out and we stamp on our records or burn them. We know where that leads to. But I'm saying that we can say, yes, this is a history that perhaps we have ignored and we haven't made accountable, but we can move forward in a different way and address it and give due. We should respect not just the Holocaust and the Jewish victims of the Nazi regime, because the victims extend far wider to Roma and Sinti, as you may know, Gypsies, to Russians, to Poles, to gay people. The atrocities affected many, many people, and there are survivors and families of survivors. And all of these, and all of that means people are still hurting and suffering. And we have a duty, always a compassionate duty and a humanitarian duty. And rock and roll, for all its wonder and brilliance, also has to accept where it has its downfalls, and we see, and we can pick it back up.
So there's the book. This Ain't Rock and Roll: Pop Music, the Swastika and the Third Reich by Daniel Rachel. Forward by Billy Bragg. Daniel, thanks very much for
very
talking
good to
us.
talk to you.
Thank you for having me.
Brilliant.